The morning of my daughter Diane baby shower dawned gray and drizzling, which should have been my first warning. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the rain streak down the glass, and tried to summon the enthusiasm expected of a soon-to-be grandmother. At 58, I'd raised 3 children mostly on my own after my husband Robert left when the youngest was barely 12. 35 years of sacrifice, of putting their needs before mine, of saying yes when I should have said no. My house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch I'd bought with my settlement money and 20 years of mortgage payments, had become the family's unofficial headquarters. Diane, now 35 and pregnant with her second child, had been living here for 8 months with her husband Dan Reed and their 4-year-old son. My son Lloyd Smith, 28, had moved back in after his divorce 6 months ago, bringing his moody silences and unpaid debts. Only my youngest, Beverly Bono, 26, had managed to stay independent, though she visited frequently enough to raid my refrigerator and borrow money she never repaid. The shower was Diane's idea, of course. "Mom, it'll be so convenient having it here," she'd said, as if convenience was the only factor that mattered. "And everyone knows how much you love entertaining." What she meant was, everyone knows how much you love doing things for free that we can't afford to pay for ourselves. I'd spent 3 days preparing, cleaning, decorating, shopping for food I couldn't really afford on my modest pension from 30 years as a school secretary. The house sparkled, pink and blue streamers hung from every doorway, and the dining room table groaned under the weight of finger foods and a cake I'd made from scratch. Diane had invited 23 people. I was expected to serve them all, smile graciously, and be grateful for the privilege. By noon, my small living room was packed with women I barely knew. Diane's friends from work, neighbors I'd waved to but never really talked with, and a handful of relatives who only appeared for major life events. The noise was overwhelming. Laughter, conversations overlapping, the constant clink of plates and glasses. I moved through it all like a ghost in my own home, refilling platters, taking coats, making sure everyone had what they needed. Diane held court in my favorite armchair, the one I'd bought for myself 3 years ago as a rare act of self-indulgence. She looked radiant in a flowing pink dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, her hand resting on her rounded belly as gifts piled up around her. Designer baby clothes, expensive gadgets, a stroller that cost more than my car payment. I watched the envy flicker across some faces and felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. "Martha's been such a saint through all this," Diane announced as I set down another tray of sandwiches. "Moving back in with me was the best decision I ever made. Mom just takes care of everything." The women smiled indulgently. One of them, Janet Waters, a coworker of Diane's, patted my arm. "You're so lucky to have such a devoted mother," she told Diane. "Not everyone would give up their space like this." Give up my space. As if I'd had a choice. As if Diane had asked, rather than simply announcing she was moving in, "Just until we get on our feet." That was 8 months ago. Dan still hadn't found steady work, and they'd made no moves toward finding their own place. Instead, they'd settled in like permanent residents, taking over my guest room, using my kitchen as their personal restaurant, treating me like live-in help. "Actually," Diane said, standing up with some difficulty, her belly prominent at 7 months, "that brings me to something exciting I want to share with everyone." She reached for the glass of sparkling cider I'd poured for her, raising it high. "Dan and I have been talking about the baby's room, and we've come up with the perfect solution." I felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in my chest. Diane's perfect solutions usually meant more work and sacrifice for me. "We've decided the baby needs the master bedroom," she continued, her voice bright with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "It's the biggest room, and with all the baby furniture and everything, it just makes the most sense. And Mom," she turned to me with that smile that had been getting her out of trouble since she was 5. "Mom is going to move out to the shed. We've been fixing it up, and it's actually quite cozy. That way the baby has plenty of space and Mom still gets to be close to help with babysitting and everything." The room went quiet for a moment. I felt 23 pairs of eyes turn to me, waiting for my reaction. The shed. They wanted me to move to the shed so their baby could have my bedroom. The bedroom I'd slept in for 15 years, in the house I'd bought with my own money, on the land I'd paid taxes on, surrounded by the furniture I'd chosen and the memories I'd made. "What do you think, Mom?" Diane prompted, that expectant smile still plastered on her face. "Isn't it perfect?" I thought about the shed, 8 by 10 feet with bare walls and a concrete floor. Dan had installed electricity last month, claiming he needed a workshop, but I could see now it had been part of their plan all along. They'd been preparing my exile without bothering to consult me. I thought about 35 years of putting their needs first. About the college funds I'd emptied to pay for Diane's wedding, the retirement savings I'd raided to help Lloyd through his divorce, the dreams I'd deferred so they could pursue theirs. I thought about how they'd moved into my home and slowly, systematically, began treating it as theirs. And then I thought about the papers I'd signed that morning, the ones sitting in my purse right now, giving me something they had no idea existed. "It sounds wonderful, sweetheart," I heard myself say, my voice steady and calm. "Absolutely perfect." The relief on Diane's face was immediate. The women in the room began chattering again, praising the arrangement, talking about how sweet it was that 3 generations would be living so close together. Someone made a joke about how I'd be the world's most convenient babysitter. Everyone laughed. I smiled and nodded, playing my part perfectly. Let them think they'd won. Let them believe they'd successfully maneuvered me into accepting their latest demand. They had no idea that the game had already changed, that the rules they'd been playing by no longer applied. The shed. They wanted to put me in the shed. By evening, they'd learn that the shed was all they had left. The last guest left at 4:30, and the house fell into that peculiar silence that follows forced celebration. I stood in my kitchen, surveying the wreckage. Dirty plates stacked on every surface, pink and blue streamers hanging limp and forgotten, the lingering smell of too many perfumes, and the sticky sweetness of spilled punch. Diane had retreated to her room for a nap, claiming the excitement had exhausted her. Dan had disappeared somewhere with Lloyd, probably to celebrate their successful manipulation of the old woman. I began cleaning methodically, the way I'd done everything for 35 years. Load the dishwasher, wipe down the counters, put away the leftover food that would feed my ungrateful family for the next 3 days. My movements were automatic, muscle memory from decades of being the woman who cleaned up after everyone else's messes. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't cleaning out of obligation or maternal duty. I was cleaning because I wanted to leave my house, my former house, exactly as it should be remembered. Spotless. Perfect. The way it had been when I'd sacrificed everything to make it a home for people who saw it as nothing more than free room and board. As I scrubbed the last plate, I let my mind drift back to that morning, to the meeting that had changed everything. 3 weeks ago, I'd received a call from Margaret Todd Whitman, a real estate attorney I'd known peripherally through church. She'd represented me during my divorce years ago, and we'd stayed in loose contact ever since. "Martha," she'd said, her voice carefully professional, "I have a rather unusual proposition for you. Are you familiar with the Riverside Valley Railroad Restoration Project?" I wasn't, but I'd listened as she explained. A private consortium was buying properties along abandoned railway lines throughout the Midwest, with plans to restore vintage train routes for luxury tourism. They needed houses at strategic points, comfortable, well-maintained homes that could serve as overnight stops for wealthy travelers wanting an authentic small-town experience. The pay was extraordinary, $25,000 for a 6-month lease, with the option to renew. "Your house fits their criteria perfectly," Margaret had continued. "Vintage charm, excellent condition, and most importantly, it's right on the old Burlington line. They want to start the program next month. $25,000. More money than I'd seen at one time since my divorce settlement. Enough to travel, to start over, to finally live for myself instead of serving as an unpaid maid and babysitter for my adult children. But there was a catch, of course. The house had to be empty. Completely empty. No permanent residents. No personal belongings cluttering the carefully curated vintage aesthetic the railroad company wanted to achieve. "I understand you have family living with you," Margaret had said carefully. That would need to change. I'd thought about it for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of watching Diane treat my home like her personal hotel. of listening to Lloyd complain about his problems while contributing nothing to household expenses, of being taken for granted by the children I'd raised to be independent adults. 3 weeks of imagining what it would feel like to wake up somewhere else. Somewhere I wasn't expected to serve everyone else's needs before my own. The baby shower had made my decision easy. Now, as I folded the last tablecloth and stored it away, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Lloyd appeared first, his dark hair rumpled, his eyes slightly glazed from whatever he and Dan had been drinking in the garage. At 28, he still had the sullen expression of a teenager who'd been asked to take out the trash. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, settling his large frame at my kitchen table without being invited. Dan followed, looking uncomfortable, but determined. At 34, my son-in-law had perfected the art of looking busy while accomplishing nothing. He'd been between jobs for the entire 8 months he'd lived in my house, though he always seemed to have money for beer and cigarettes. "What about?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. "About the arrangement," Lloyd said. "Diane told us about the shed thing, and we want to make sure you're really okay with it." The shed thing. As if my displacement was just a minor logistical detail. "We know it's a big change," Dan added, his voice taking on that patronizing tone men use when they're about to explain why you should be grateful for something you never wanted. "But we've been thinking about it, and it really is the best solution for everyone." I leaned against the counter, studying their faces. Lloyd looked defensive, the way he had as a child when he'd been caught doing something he knew was wrong, but refused to admit it. Dan looked calculating, like he was working out how to sell me on an idea that benefited only him. "Everyone?" I repeated. "Well, yeah," Lloyd said. "I mean, the baby needs space, and you're always saying how you don't use the master bedroom that much anyway. Plus, the shed's got electricity now, and we could put in a little heater. It could be really cozy." Cozy. An 8x10 concrete box was going to be cozy. "And think about it, Mom," Dan said, warming to his theme. "You'd be right there to help with the baby. Diane's going to need so much support, especially in those first few months. Having you close by but not underfoot." He caught himself, but not quickly enough. "I mean, having your own space but still being available to help. It's perfect. Available to help. Underfoot." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for months. This wasn't about the baby needing space. This was about them wanting me conveniently stored where I could serve their needs without inconveniencing their lives. "Plus," Lloyd continued, "it would save us all money. If we had to get our own place, it would be expensive, and you know how tight things are right now. This way we can all help each other out." Help each other out. Lloyd hadn't paid rent, utilities, or contributed to groceries in 6 months. Dan hadn't worked in 8 months but somehow always had money for his personal expenses. Diane treated me like a combination maid, cook, and unpaid childcare service. But somehow, in their twisted logic, moving me to a shed was helping each other out. I looked at these two men, my son and my son-in-law, and saw them clearly for perhaps the first time. Lloyd, nearly 30 years old, still expecting his mother to solve his problems and absorb his failures. Dan, a grown man who'd moved his pregnant wife into another woman's house and now wanted to claim the master bedroom as his own. Neither of them had asked what I wanted. Neither had considered that I might have plans or dreams or needs of my own. They were waiting for my response, confident in their ability to manipulate me into compliance. After all, it had worked for 35 years. Why wouldn't it work now? "You've really thought this through," I said finally. "We have," Dan said, relief evident in his voice. "We want what's best for everyone. And you think the best thing for me is to live in a shed so you can have my bedroom?" Lloyd shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, don't make it sound like that. It's not about taking anything from you. It's about making smart use of space." Smart use of space. My space. The space I'd paid for, maintained, and called home for 15 years. "I appreciate you both being so concerned about my living arrangements," I said, my voice perfectly level. "It shows how much you care about my comfort and happiness." They exchanged glances, not quite sure if I was being sarcastic but encouraged by my calm tone. "So, you're okay with it?" Dan asked. Oh, I think the arrangement is going to work out perfectly, I said. In fact, I think it's going to be exactly what everyone deserves. Lloyd smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him in months. Great, Mom. I knew you'd understand. You always do. I always do. Yes, I suppose I always had understood. I'd understood when they moved in, temporarily, and made themselves permanent residents. I'd understood when they ate my food, used my utilities, and treated my home like their personal hotel. I'd understood when they made plans for my life without consulting me, when they decided my needs were less important than their convenience. But understanding and accepting are two different things. And today, finally, I'd stopped accepting. When were you planning to make this transition? I asked. Well, Dan said, we were thinking maybe next weekend. That would give us time to move the furniture around, get the baby's room set up properly. Next weekend. They'd already planned it all out, down to the timeline for my exile. That sounds perfect, I said. Absolutely perfect timing. And it was. Because next weekend, they were going to learn that the shed wasn't the only surprise waiting for them. Next weekend, they were going to discover what it felt like when the person they'd taken for granted finally stopped taking care of them. Next weekend, the real game would begin. The week that followed, the baby shower passed in a blur of barely contained anticipation. I moved through my daily routines with the precision of someone following a carefully orchestrated plan. Each morning, I woke before dawn and sat at my kitchen table with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the property that would soon no longer be my problem. Each evening, I listened to my family make their plans for my displacement with the detached interest of someone watching actors rehearse a play. Diane spent her days nesting with manic intensity, ordering furniture online with money she didn't have, planning the nursery down to the last decorative detail. She'd commandeered my dining room table as her headquarters, spreading out paint samples and fabric swatches like a general planning a military campaign. Mom, what do you think of this crib? She'd ask, showing me pictures on her laptop of furniture that cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. Dan thinks the white one is too plain, but I love how clean it looks. I'd nod and make appropriate sounds of approval, all while calculating how much debt they were accumulating. The credit card statements that came in Dan's name but were delivered to my address told the real story. $15,000 in the last 6 months. Baby gear, restaurant meals, entertainment, clothes, all charged against a future income that existed only in Dan's increasingly desperate fantasies about landing the perfect job. Lloyd had thrown himself into the shed renovation with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found a project that benefited him directly. He'd installed insulation, painted the walls a cheerful yellow that was supposed to make the concrete box feel homey, and even put in a small window. Every improvement was presented to me like a gift I should be grateful for. Look, Mom, I found this little electric heater at a garage sale, he'd announced on Wednesday, carrying in an ancient space heater that looked like a fire hazard waiting to happen. It'll keep you nice and warm out there. Nice and warm in my 8x10 prison. I'd thanked him appropriately and made a mental note to add the heater to the list of things that would soon be someone else's problem. Dan had begun treating the house like his personal domain, rearranging furniture to suit his preferences, claiming the best parking spot in the driveway, even hanging his jacket on the hook by the front door that had been mine for 15 years. Small gestures of ownership that made his intentions clear. This was his house now, and I was just a temporary inconvenience to be managed. The most revealing moment came on Thursday evening. I was making dinner, as always, when Dan strolled into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator like he owned it. "Martha?" he said, not bothering to look at me as he grabbed a beer. "Diane and I were talking, and we think it might be better if you ate your meals out in the shed once we get everything set up. You know, to give us some family time, and the baby's going to need quiet during feeding times." Family time. I wasn't family, apparently. I was the hired help who'd been promoted to live-in shed dweller. "That sounds very considerate," I said, stirring the pasta sauce that would feed all of them. "I wouldn't want to intrude on your family time." He looked at me then, and I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, that I'd agreed so easily. For just a moment, he seemed to question whether this was all going too smoothly. But the moment passed, and his natural arrogance reasserted itself. "Great. I'm glad you understand. Diane was worried you might take it the wrong way. Take it the wrong way. As if there was a right way to be told you were being exiled from your own kitchen table. But the most illuminating conversation happened on Friday morning. I was folding laundry, their laundry naturally, when I overheard Diane on the phone with someone, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. No, she's being completely reasonable about it, Diane was saying. I mean, I was worried she might get all emotional and difficult, but she's actually excited about having her own space. She keeps talking about how cozy it's going to be. I'd never said any such thing, but Diane had apparently decided that's what I felt. Dan thinks we should probably start charging her rent once everything settles down, she continued. I mean, she'll still have electricity and water and we'll be maintaining the property. It's only fair that she contributes something. Charge me rent. To live in a shed, on property I owned. The best part is, she'll still be available for babysitting whenever we need her, but we won't have to worry about her opinions on how we raise the kids. Win-win, right? Win-win. Available for babysitting but dismissed from decision-making. Convenient but contained. It was a perfect summary of how they saw me. A useful appliance to be stored appropriately when not in active use. I finished folding their clothes with mechanical precision, thinking about the phone call I'd made that morning to Margaret Todd Whitman. Everything's confirmed, Margaret had told me. The railroad company is thrilled with the property. The lease begins Monday morning, and they'll have a crew here Sunday evening to stage the house. You'll need everyone out by 6 p.m. Sunday. Sunday, 2 days away. 2 days before my family's carefully laid plans would collide with reality. And Martha, Margaret had added, I want you to know this is exactly the kind of fresh start you deserve. You've spent enough years taking care of everyone else. Everyone else. Yes, I supposed I had. That afternoon, Lloyd cornered me in the kitchen with the excited energy of someone about to share good news. Mom, I've got it all figured out, he said, pulling out his phone to show me pictures he'd taken of the shed. Look, we set up the bed right here, and there's room for a little dresser by the window. And see this corner? Perfect spot for a mini fridge, so you won't have to come into the house for snacks and stuff. Won't have to come into the house. My house. For food from my refrigerator that I'd paid for. It's really going to be perfect, he continued. Your own little apartment, practically. And hey, think of all the money you'll save on utilities, only heating that small space instead of this whole house. All the money I'd save. As if my financial situation was somehow going to improve by being relegated to a concrete box while they enjoyed the comfort I'd worked 30 years to create. Lloyd, I said carefully, have you and Diane and Dan given any thought to what happens if this arrangement doesn't work out? He looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, what if I decide I don't want to live in the shed? What if I want to make other arrangements? His face went through several expressions, confusion, surprise, and finally something that looked almost like panic. But Mom, where would you go? And what about us? I mean, we can't afford rent somewhere else right now, and Diane needs to be settled before the baby comes. You wouldn't just leave us hanging, would you? Leave them hanging. The phrase was rich with unintentional irony. They could push me into a shed, charge me rent to live on my own property, and exclude me from my own kitchen. But the idea that I might have my own plans was apparently inconceivable. I'm just asking hypothetically, I said, planning for all possibilities. Well, hypothetically, Lloyd said, his voice taking on that edge it got when he felt threatened. I think you'd have a hard time finding anything as good as this arrangement. I mean, you're getting older, Mom. It's not like you have a lot of options. Getting older. Not a lot of options. At 58, I was apparently over the hill and ready for the shed. You're probably right, I said. This is probably the best I can hope for. Relief flooded his face. Exactly. And hey, it's going to be great having 3 generations all living together. The baby's going to love having Grandma so close by. So close by. So conveniently available. So easily controlled. That evening, as I prepared what would be my last dinner in my own kitchen for people who'd decided I no longer deserved to eat at my own table, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced in years. They'd made their plans so carefully, considered every angle except the one that mattered most. What I wanted. Sunday was 36 hours away. Sunday, when the railroad company's staging crew would arrive to prepare my house for its new role as a luxury stopover for wealthy travelers. Sunday, when Diane and Lloyd and Dan would discover that the woman they'd taken for granted for 35 years had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Some games can only be won by refusing to play by the other person's rules, and I was done playing by theirs. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything seem sharper, more defined. I woke at 5:30, as I had every day for the past 35 years. But this time the familiar routine felt different. Final. I made my coffee in the kitchen that would soon belong to strangers, sat at the table where my ungrateful family had made their plans to exile me, and watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and amber. Today was the last day they would wake up in my house believing they owned it. The moving process had begun in earnest. Diane directed operations from the couch, her pregnancy giving her an excuse to supervise rather than participate. Lloyd and Dan Dianed furniture between rooms with the satisfied efficiency of men claiming territory. They'd already moved most of my belongings to the shed, clothes I rarely wore, books I'd read years ago, the small television from my bedroom that would now serve as my primary entertainment. "Mom, where do you want this?" Lloyd asked, holding up the framed photo of my parents that had sat on my dresser for 20 years. "Just put it anywhere," I said. "I'm sure I'll find the right spot for it." He nodded and disappeared toward the shed, probably thinking how accommodating I was being. How easy this transition was proving to be. If he'd looked more closely, he might have noticed that I wasn't packing the things that mattered most. My important documents, my jewelry, the photo albums that contained 35 years of memories. Those items were already safely stored in a safety deposit box downtown, along with the signed lease agreement that would change everything in less than 24 hours. By noon, the master bedroom had been transformed. Diane's vision of the perfect nursery was taking shape. White furniture arranged with magazine-perfect precision, a rocking chair positioned by the window, a mobile hanging above the crib that played lullabies when wound. It was beautiful, I had to admit. It was also temporary. "What do you think, Mom?" Diane asked, gesturing proudly at the room that had been mine for 15 years. "Isn't it perfect?" "It's exactly what you wanted," I said, which was the truth. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted, just not for as long as she expected. The afternoon brought visitors. Beverly Bono, my youngest daughter, arrived with her husband Gary Jones and their 6-year-old daughter. Beverly had always been the most diplomatic of my children, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and find compromises. She took one look at the situation and pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Mom, are you really okay with this?" she asked, her voice low with concern. "Because this seems, I don't know, extreme." At 26, Beverly had inherited my features but not my patience. She'd built a successful career as a dental hygienist and had never asked me for money or moved back home when times got tough. Of all my children, she was the only one who'd achieved actual independence. "It's what Diane needs," I said, giving her the same calm response I'd given everyone else. "But what about what you need?" Beverly pressed. "When's the last time anyone asked you what you wanted?" What I wanted. It was such a simple question, but no one else had thought to ask it. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been regret, not for what I was about to do, but for the fact that it was necessary. Beverly was different from her siblings. She might have tried to find a better solution if she'd known what was coming, but it was too late for better solutions. The damage had been done over months and years of small cruelties, thoughtless demands, and entitled assumptions. One conversation with Beverly couldn't undo 35 years of being taken for granted. "I want what's best for everyone," I said finally. "And sometimes what's best isn't what people expect." Beverly studied my face with the sharp attention she'd inherited from her father. For a moment, I thought she might push further, might ask the questions that could unravel everything. But Diane called from the living room, wanting Beverly to see the nursery, and the moment passed. The rest of the afternoon proceeded according to script. Family members admired the baby's room, praised the clever solution to the space problem, and made jokes about how I'd be the world's most convenient babysitter. No one asked if I was happy about the arrangement. No one wondered if I might have preferred to be consulted before my living situation was decided for me. By 6 o'clock, the transformation was complete. My former bedroom looked like a spread from a parenting magazine. The shed had been converted into what Lloyd optimistically called a granny flat, complete with a small bed, a mini fridge, and enough space for one person to exist without taking up too much room in anyone else's life. The family gathered in the living room for what Diane declared a celebration dinner. Pizza ordered with money they didn't have, eaten off paper plates to avoid doing dishes in my kitchen. Dan opened a beer and raised it in a toast. To new beginnings, he said, and to having everything work out perfectly for everyone. Everyone echoed the toast. I smiled and nodded, playing my part one last time. Actually, I said, standing up with my glass of water, I have something I'd like to say. The room fell quiet. Lloyd looked vaguely nervous, probably wondering if I was about to get emotional and make things awkward. Diane smiled expectantly, no doubt anticipating a speech about how grateful I was for their thoughtful solution to the space problem. I want to thank you all, I began, my voice steady and clear, for teaching me such valuable lessons about family. Nods and smiles around the room. This was going exactly as they expected. You've taught me that sacrifice is only meaningful when it's voluntary, that generosity stops being a virtue when it's taken for granted, and most importantly, that love without respect isn't love at all. It's just exploitation with better marketing. The smiles began to fade. Lloyd and Dan exchanged glances. Diane shifted uncomfortably on the couch. You've also taught me that when people show you who they really are, you should believe them. And over the past 8 months, you've shown me exactly who you are. Mom, Lloyd said, his voice carrying a warning. What are you getting at? I'm getting at the fact that tomorrow morning, you're all going to need to find somewhere else to live. The silence that followed was profound. Beverly's husband Gary looked confused, clearly missing context. Beverly herself had gone very still, her eyes fixed on my face with growing understanding. Diane's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. What do you mean? Dan asked, his voice careful and controlled. I mean that as of 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, this house will be occupied by representatives of the Riverside Valley Railroad Company, who will be preparing it for its new role as a luxury accommodation for train travelers. You have until 6 p.m. tomorrow to remove yourselves and all your belongings. The explosion of voices was immediate and overlapping. You can't do that! Diane's voice rose to a near shriek. I'm 7 months pregnant. Where are we supposed to go? Mom, what the hell are you talking about? Lloyd was on his feet, his face flushed with anger. You can't just kick us out. We live here. No, I said calmly. You've been staying here. There's a difference, though I understand why you might be confused about that. Dan's voice cut through the chaos, cold and calculating. You're bluffing. You wouldn't do this to your own daughter, not when she's pregnant. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded contract, holding it up so they could all see it. 6-month lease, renewable option, $25,000 paid in advance. The railroad company took possession of the property at midnight last night. Legally, you're all trespassing. Diane began to cry. Not the quiet tears of genuine emotion, but the dramatic sobs she'd used to manipulate people since childhood. How could you do this to me? To your grandchild? The same way you could decide to move me into a shed without asking my opinion, I said. The same way you could plan to charge me rent to live on my own property. The same way you could exclude me from my own kitchen table. I learned from the best. Lloyd's anger was building toward something dangerous. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the clenched fists at his sides. You can't do this, Mom. I won't let you. You won't let me? I laughed, and the sound surprised even me, cold and sharp as breaking glass. Lloyd, you're a 28-year-old man who hasn't paid rent or utilities in 6 months. What exactly are you going to do to stop me? Beverly finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. Mom, is this really what you want? I looked at her, the only one of my children who'd asked what I wanted instead of telling me what I should accept. What I wanted was to be treated with respect in my own home, I said. What I wanted was to be consulted before my life was rearranged for other people's convenience. What I wanted was to feel like a mother instead of an unpaid servant. But since none of that seemed possible, yes, this is what I want. The house fell silent except for Diane's continued sobbing. Outside, the sun was setting on the last day my family would take me for granted. Tomorrow they would learn what the world looked like without the safety net they'd never appreciated. Tomorrow, the real consequences would begin. Sunday morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts through even the warmest jacket. I woke in my motel room across town at exactly 5:30, my internal clock unchanged despite sleeping in an unfamiliar bed. Through the thin walls, I could hear the sounds of other people's lives, a television playing morning news, a shower running, the distant hum of highway traffic, anonymous sounds from anonymous people who didn't know or care about the drama unfolding 12 miles away. I'd left the house Saturday night after delivering my ultimatum, driving away while my family stood in the living room, trying to process what had just happened. I hadn't looked back. There was nothing left to see that I hadn't already witnessed. The shocked faces, the disbelief, the slow dawning realization that the woman they'd taken for granted had finally reached her limit. My phone had been ringing since 7 p.m. Saturday. 15 missed calls from Lloyd, 12 from Diane, 8 from Dan. I'd turned it off after the first hour. Whatever they had to say, I'd heard it all before in different variations over the past 35 years. Apologies that were really accusations. Promises that were really manipulation. Attempts to make me feel guilty for finally putting my own needs first. At 8 a.m., I drove to Margaret Todd Whitman's office to finalize the paperwork. She greeted me with coffee and a satisfied smile. "How do you feel?" she asked as I signed the last document, officially transferring temporary control of my property to the railroad company. "Lighter," I said, and realized it was true. For the first time in decades, I wasn't responsible for anyone else's problems. I wasn't expected to solve anyone else's crises. I wasn't required to sacrifice my comfort for someone else's convenience. "The railroad company is thrilled with the property," Margaret continued. "They're planning to feature it prominently in their marketing materials. Authentic Midwestern home, perfectly preserved. They've even asked if they can interview you about the house's history for their promotional videos." I almost laughed. If they only knew the real history, 35 years of slowly losing myself to other people's needs and demands. But that story was ending. Today marked the beginning of something entirely new. At 10 a.m., I drove past my former house. The railroad company's staging crew had arrived promptly at 8, and the transformation was already underway. Professional movers Dianed furniture out to a waiting truck. Interior designers consulted clipboards and pointed at windows. A photographer documented every room for the company's promotional materials. I parked across the street and watched strangers take possession of the space I'd called home for 15 years. It should have felt like a loss, but it didn't. It felt like watching someone else clean up a mess I was tired of dealing with. At 10:15, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Lloyd's old Honda, packed so full of belongings that the rear bumper nearly scraped the ground. I watched him get out and approach one of the railroad workers, his body language aggressive and demanding. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes before the worker pointed to a sign and walked away. Lloyd stood there for a moment, staring at the house that was no longer available to him, then got back in his car and drove away. Diane and Dan arrived an hour later in a rented U-Haul truck that probably cost them money they didn't have. I watched Diane lumber out of the passenger seat, her pregnancy making every movement awkward and labored. She stood in the driveway for a long time, staring at the house where she'd planned to raise her child, where she'd expected to live rent-free while her mother served as unpaid childcare. Dan tried to negotiate with the railroad workers, his voice carrying across the street though I couldn't make out the words. His gestures grew increasingly animated as the conversation progressed, and I could see the moment when he realized that no amount of charm or argumentation was going to change the situation. Money talks louder than manipulation, and the railroad company had paid for exclusive access to the property. They loaded their belongings into the truck with mechanical efficiency, their movements sharp with suppressed anger. No one looked toward the shed where they'd planned to store me. No one seemed to consider what had happened to the woman they'd displaced from her own bedroom. They were too busy dealing with the consequences of their own choices to spare a thought for mine. Beverly arrived as they were finishing, driving up in her sensible sedan with her husband and daughter. She got out slowly, surveying the scene with the analytical eye that had served her well in her career. Unlike her siblings, she didn't try to argue with the railroad workers or demand explanations. She simply helped load the last few boxes and hugged Diane goodbye. As the U-Haul pulled away, Beverly stood alone in the driveway, looking up at the house. Then she turned and looked directly at me, her gaze finding mine across the street with unerring accuracy. For a moment, our eyes met through my car windshield. She didn't wave or gesture. She simply nodded once, an acknowledgement that she understood what had happened and why. Then she got in her car and drove away, leaving me alone with the strangers who were transforming my former home into something completely different. That evening, I checked into the extended stay hotel where I'd be living for the next month while I made my permanent plans. The room was small but comfortable, with a kitchenette and enough space for one person who didn't need much. I ordered Chinese takeout and ate it while watching the sunset through my window, thinking about the train trips I would take with my lease money. Scotland first, I'd decided, then maybe Ireland. After that, perhaps a journey through Eastern Europe, following railway lines through countries I'd only read about in books. I had 6 months of freedom ahead of me, and for the first time in 35 years, no one else's schedule to consider. My phone buzzed with a text message. Against my better judgment, I looked at it. Mom, we're staying at the Riverside Inn until we figure things out. Room 237. Diane needs to see a doctor about stress affecting the baby. We need to talk. Lloyd. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. There was nothing to talk about. They'd made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. The stress affecting Diane's baby was the same stress she'd been happy to inflict on me when she decided I should live in a shed. The urgency of their housing situation was the same urgency they'd dismissed when they assumed I had no other options. The Riverside Inn charged $80 a night. With 3 adults needing accommodations, they were looking at nearly $250 per day. Their credit cards were already maxed out from baby purchases and 8 months of treating my house like a free hotel. By my calculations, they had maybe a week before they'd be forced to make the kinds of difficult decisions I'd been making alone for decades. Lloyd would probably move back in with his ex-wife, swallowing his pride long enough to secure a roof over his head. Diane and Dan would likely end up with his parents, who had a spare room and the kind of income that came from 2 people working instead of depending on others to subsidize their lifestyle. It wouldn't be comfortable for any of them, but it would be educational. Over the following weeks, I heard updates through the small-town gossip network that had always been more efficient than any newspaper. Lloyd had indeed returned to his ex-wife, who'd agreed to let him sleep on her couch in exchange for actual child support payments for their daughter. Diane and Dan had moved in with his parents, where they were learning what it felt like to be the dependent relatives following someone else's rules. The railroad company's first group of guests arrived in November, and the local paper ran a feature story about the historic home that had been transformed into a luxury accommodation. There was no mention of the family that had been displaced, no acknowledgement of the woman who'd been expected to give up her bedroom for a baby that wasn't even born yet. In December, I received a Christmas card from Beverly. Inside, she'd written simply, "I hope you're finding what you were looking for. Love, Beverly." I was. For the first time in 35 years, I was living for myself instead of serving as an unpaid solution to other people's problems. The train trips had been everything I'd hoped. Days of watching landscapes roll past my window while I wrote in the journal that would become my book. Evenings in small European towns where no one knew my history or expected anything from me except payment for services rendered. By spring, I'd decided not to renew the railroad lease. The 6 months had given me exactly what I needed: perspective, distance, and the financial foundation for a completely new life. I sold the house to a young couple who saw it as their dream home, rather than a convenient hotel with free room service. The sale proceeds, combined with my savings and the lease money, gave me enough to buy a small cottage in Vermont, near a train station but far from anyone who remembered Martha White as a woman who existed to serve other people's needs. I kept only Beverly's address for holiday cards. The others would have to learn to solve their own problems. On my 60th birthday, I sat on my own front porch, drinking coffee from my own cup, reading a letter from my publisher about my memoir. The Shed, How I Learned to Stop Being Convenient, would be published in the fall. The advance was modest but meaningful, money I'd earned by telling my own story instead of enabling someone else's. My phone didn't ring with birthday wishes from Lloyd or Diane. I hadn't expected it to. Some bridges, once burned, are meant to stay that way. But Beverly sent flowers, white roses with a card that read, "Happy birthday, Mom. I'm proud of you." And finally, that was enough.